The 2026 season hadn't even reached its halfway point when the messages started circulating inside paddock circles. Not press releases, not official statements. Quiet conversations between engineers, team principals, and FIA officials who all knew the same uncomfortable truth. The future Formula One had spent nearly a decade designing wasn't working the way anyone had promised. The warning signs were visible years before the first race. Drivers saw them, engineers saw them, some team principals saw them, but Formula One was too committed to turn back. Formula One spent nearly a decade building these regulations. Drivers spent years warning there was a problem, and less than a season into the new era, the sport is already changing course. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to understand what the 2026 regulations actually represented. The FIA tore apart the existing power unit formula and built a new one around an entirely different vision of the future. Sustainable fuels, active aerodynamics, the removal of the MGU-H, and a near 50-50 split between combustion and electric power. The MGU-H, the heat energy recovery system that had defined hybrid Formula One since 2014, was removed entirely. The new power units would run on 100% sustainable fuel. Active aerodynamics would return to the sport for the first time in decades. And at the center of everything sat the headline concept, a near 50-50 split between combustion power and electrical deployment. Roughly 53% internal combustion, 47% electric. The FIA genuinely believed this was the right direction, a Formula One that could speak to road car manufacturers. A Formula One that could justify its existence in a world increasingly focused on electrification. Half combustion, half electric, by design, by philosophy, by conviction. The manufacturers believed it too. Audi committed as a full works manufacturer, taking over the Sauber operation and building an entire F1 program around this vision. Ford partnered with Red Bull powertrains. General Motors entered through Cadillac, paying a reported $450 million anti-delusion fee to join the grid. Honda stayed. Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull all invested hundreds of millions in new power unit development. The combined financial commitment across the paddock ran into the billions. Thousands of engineers, years of development, entire facilities built around one shared assumption about what Formula One would be. That assumption was about to meet reality. When drivers first began running simulations and development programs for the 2026 cars, the feedback arrived fast, and it arrived unanimously. Carlos Sainz had been warning about the problem for years. During early simulator testing of the 2026 concept, he described the closing speeds created by battery depletion as very dangerous to the drivers. As testing continued, the concerns became more widespread. Oscar Piastri called the combination of active aero, battery deployment, and race starts a recipe for disaster. Fernando Alonso joked that Formula One was becoming the Battery World Championship. Then, the season started. During the Australian Grand Prix, Charles Leclerc compared the new deployment systems to the mushroom boost in Mario Kart. A few weeks later in China, Max Verstappen delivered the verdict that would come to define the debate. It's playing Mario Kart. This is not racing. You boost past, then you run out of battery the next straight, they boost past you again. For me, it's just a joke. Verstappen had already described the cars as Formula E on steroids during pre-season testing. He wasn't alone. Across the grid, drivers were reaching the same conclusion. The regulations had created a problem that could not be ignored. 6 drivers, multiple teams, different nationalities, different generations, different engineering philosophies behind them, all arriving at the same conclusion independently. This wasn't a coordinated paddock protest. This was the entire grid, in their own words, describing the same fundamental problem. The FIA had built the future. The drivers drove it. And they all said the same thing. For a while, the sport said nothing back. Then, qualifying started at Albert Park, and everything changed. Engineers had spent years building these cars, hundreds of millions invested, thousands of hours in simulation, the most sophisticated power units Formula One had ever produced. Then the cars hit the track, and drivers started lifting on the straights. Not for a corner, not to save tyres, not for fuel, on the straights, in qualifying. At the Australian Grand Prix, the race that was supposed to announce the dawn of a new era to the world. Albert Park is one of the worst circuits on the calendar for energy harvesting. The braking zones are short and light, which means the cars can't recover enough electrical charge to sustain full deployment on the straights. So, drivers were forced into something engineers called super clipping, staying at full throttle while the MGUK simultaneously harvested up to 250 kilowatts from the engine. The car was accelerating and braking itself at the same time, on a straight, in qualifying. The cars looked wrong, they sounded wrong, and anyone who understood what they were watching knew immediately that this wasn't a teething problem. This was the concept. Charles Leclerc climbed out of his Ferrari and reached for the only comparison that made sense. Mario Kart. The mushroom boost. You get a burst of speed, then it runs out, then the person behind gets their burst, then it runs out. Back and forth. Not because of skill, not because of bravery, because of who timed their battery deployment better. The FIA opened a review, but they wanted more data. China would be the real test, they said. Shanghai's longer straights and heavier braking zones would give a more representative picture. The paddock waited. China complicated everything. The paddock had expected Shanghai to be a disaster. Instead, it delivered something far more unsettling. The heavy braking zones allowed the cars to recover far more energy than they could at Melbourne. The worst examples of superclipping largely disappeared. The immediate panic faded, but the contrast between the two races created a different problem entirely. Melbourne had exposed the weaknesses of the regulations. Shanghai exposed their sensitivity. 2 races into the new era, Formula One had discovered that the entire concept behaved very differently depending on circuit characteristics, energy recovery opportunities, and battery demands. A formula that worked at one track and fell apart at another wasn't a formula with teething problems. It was a formula with a structural one. The warnings drivers had spent years making were no longer theoretical. They were visible in the data. And the FIA could no longer look away. Because here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. Formula One became so focused on road car relevance that it stopped asking whether the racing would actually be better. The 50-50 split was a philosophical choice, a deliberate decision to prioritize what Formula One could represent over what Formula One could produce on track. Is Formula One a technology competition or a racing competition? That question has a longer history than the 2026 regulations. But the 2026 era forced it into the open in a way the sport couldn't manage quietly. And the manufacturers who had committed billions to one answer were now watching the racing product deliver a very different one. Audi had built their entire F1 program around the 50-50 vision, the factory, the engineers, the takeover of Sauber. Every decision made in Ingolstadt pointed toward a formula that was half electric, by design. Before their first season was even complete, Formula One had already begun moving away from the vision Audi built for. Ford had returned to Formula One, specifically because the 2026 regulations aligned with their road car strategy. A hybrid forward formula with sustainable fuels made sense in Ford's boardroom. The shift back toward combustion dominance changes that alignment in ways that will need to be quietly processed at the highest levels of the company. The manufacturers who entered this sport based on one set of promises are now racing in a formula that is actively moving toward a different set of answers. Then came the moment nobody expected. Formula One blinked. Formula One bosses, the teams, and the FIA formally agreed to a phased overhaul of the power unit regulations. In 2027, the power split shifts to 58% combustion, 42% electric. Maximum electrical deployment drops from 350 kilowatts to 300. In 2028, it moves again, 60-40. The combustion engine becomes, unambiguously, the dominant power source once more. The FIA described this as optimization, refinement, evolution based on real-world data. Here is what it actually is. The near 50-50 split that defined the entire regulatory philosophy, the concept that attracted manufacturers, justified billions in investment, and shaped years of development, is being systematically dismantled before the regulations have completed a full season of racing. The regulations aren't being abandoned, but the philosophy behind them is already changing. And here is the part that doesn't make the press releases. The changes weren't simply handed down from the FIA after a moment of honest reflection. They were negotiated, compromised, pulled and pushed between manufacturers, teams, and governing body officials who all had different interests to protect. Verstappen, after the announcement, said he was a bit sad about the politics involved, and that he wished the 2027 changes would already match what's coming in 2028. The drivers had asked for more. They were given less. What Formula One announced as progress was, in the room where it was decided, a settlement. Formula One will never stand on a stage and say it got this wrong. The language will always be adjustment. The sport has a remarkable institutional capacity for reframing retreat as progress, but actions carry more information than press releases. And the action here is a 10 percentage point swing away from the vision the sport spent a decade building toward. The drivers welcomed the change, but their reaction told the real story. Lando Norris called it a small step in the right direction, then immediately said he wanted even more going into the future. Oscar Piastri acknowledged the adjustment while noting it was not eliminating the problems for sure. And Sergio Perez, perhaps the most honest of all, said simply, "It's not going to change the world. It's never going to go back to what we used to have." Read those quotes carefully. These are drivers responding to a rule change that Formula One presented as a meaningful correction, and their collective reaction was appreciated, insufficient, irreversible. That last word is the one that lingers. Irreversible. The 2026 era has already happened. The manufacturers committed, the factories were built, the engineers were hired. Audi designed a power unit for a formula that is already moving away from the philosophy that created it. Ford returned to the sport for a vision that is being quietly revised. The competitive order is shifting in ways nobody has fully mapped yet, and the drivers, who warned about all of this from the very beginning, are now being told that a partial fix is the best the sport can do. Did Formula One discover a flaw in the regulations, a technical miscalculation that can be corrected through careful adjustment? Or did the drivers discover a flaw in Formula One's vision of the future, a fundamental misunderstanding of what the sport is, what it's for, and what it loses when it tries to become something it was never designed to be? The FIA will call it optimization. Verstappen called the politics sad. Perez said it won't change the world. And somewhere in the space between a governing body that can't admit failure and drivers who know the problem isn't fully solved, that is where the truth about what Formula One just admitted actually lives.